welcome along to the first of a new series of events from the Work Foundation, looking at the changing state of the UK labour market. My name's Ben Harrison. I'm director at the Work Foundation, a think tank based at Lancaster University Management School. For those of you who don't know us, the Work Foundation has a long and storied history stretching all the way back to 1918 and the Industrial Society. And throughout the past century in our various guises, we've been committed to supporting everyone to access well-paid, secure employment and to support organisations to maximise the potential of their teams. I'm delighted to be joined by a fantastic panel of contributors this afternoon, including Lord Gavin Barwell, former Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister and a former Government Minister, Helen Barnard, Director of Policy and Research at Pro Bono Economics and Associate Director at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and Sonali Punhani, Chief UK Economist at Credit Suisse. Together, we'll be discussing the latest monthly labour market data released by ONS this morning, but also some of the wider trends, challenges and opportunities shaping the labour market as we enter 2022, and hopefully a period of relative, and I use that word advisedly, stability and recovery after the unprecedented disruption of the COVID pandemic since 2020. To help set the scene for that conversation, I do just want to share a top-level summary of the latest data from this morning, and a slide will come up shortly with some of those key data points in, as well as a bit of the story of what we see happening in the labour market more broadly. You can find a more detailed analysis blog from the Work Foundation on our website. So what have we seen today? Well, in some respects, the headline numbers at first glance can look positive. I'm sure we'll see the government pointing to the fact that we now have record levels of payrolled employees, with 29.5 million of us on the payroll as of December 2021. Employment overall continues to be high, with further small increases in the employment rate and a further small decrease in the unemployment rate. And of course, job vacancies continue to soar, over double the level recorded in the same period prior to the beginning of the pandemic. However, beneath some of these headlines, there are causes for concern, which we will get into more detail on as we go through this afternoon. In particular, on vacancies, we know that many employers are reporting that they've never had such a challenge to fill roles, and skills mismatches seem to be a particular issue here. Economic inactivity has also grown significantly despite this rise in vacancies, and we now have hundreds of thousands of people no longer looking for work compared to prior to the pandemic. In no small part, it seems driven by a rise in long-term sickness and ill health, but also early retirement as well. And we need to understand much more about why particular groups are no longer looking for work and what can be done to support them back into the labour market. Inflation is also outpacing wage growth, and we've heard a lot in recent weeks about the forthcoming cost of living crisis. Growth in average total pay was 4.3% across the last year, compared to inflation at 5.4%. And of course, we know that in some sectors, the picture is very much worse. For example, in construction and manufacturing, wages have risen just by 2.4%. We do, though, have the beginning of at least some policy responses to these challenges, ranging from the very big ambitions of the levelling up agenda, with the white paper produced just a couple of weeks ago, acknowledging that living standards, pay and good work will be key to delivering on it, through to more recent announcements aimed, in the government's own terms, at getting those out of work into any job, the Way to Work scheme. But I'm now going to invite our guests to each provide some initial reflections on the data released today, as well as the ways they see the broader outlook for the labour market and the wider economy going forward. And I'd like to begin with you, Sonali. Clearly, given the work that you do as Chief UK Economist at Credit Suisse, you'll be looking at the longer term health of the UK economy and the labour market more widely. So it would be excellent if you could give your perspective on what these latest figures are telling us and what the overall outlook for growth and jobs is as we enter 2022.
Great, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, for joining. Yeah, so I think, as Ben mentioned, the labor markets are quite tight in the UK, and I think we need to realize and sort of take a stock of the fact at how impressive and what the good news has been behind these labor market statistics. So unemployment, for example, has fallen to 4.1%, which is close to the pre-pandemic levels of unemployment. And just putting this in perspective, during the global financial crisis, UK unemployment almost took almost 6 years to fall back to pre-crisis levels. So the fact that we've seen such a big drop and the recovery during the pandemic has been quite impressive, where we are almost back to pre-COVID levels in about a year and a half. Now, that's clearly to do with the unusual shape of the global and UK growth recovery, as well as recovery in the labor market, where there was a massive drop in GDP and labor demand, for example, when the UK economy and global economy was in lockdown. But once the lockdowns were removed, we saw a big pickup in both growth and labor demand. What was also interesting is that we had fiscal support during this time, which meant we had furlough schemes during this time, which meant that workers were attached to their jobs and household incomes were sustained during the pandemic. And this allowed for firstly, employment to come back pretty quickly once the restrictions were eased, but also demand to come back fairly quickly because households sustained their incomes during the pandemic. So this is in some way the good news in terms of the labor market statistics. And we are seeing that now labor demand continues to be strong. As Ben mentioned, vacancies are at record highs, and even forward-looking indicators of labor demand from different surveys are at record highs. The fact that we are forecasting above trend growth in this year for the UK, that means that labor demand should stay elevated. The flip side has been the squeeze that we have seen in labor supply during the pandemic. And this is not just a UK specific story. Globally, many people who were in the workforce have not returned, and labor supply remains depressed. And this sort of adds to the demographic pressures that were already building before the pandemic. This participation problem is the biggest in the US, but in the UK as well, labor force participation stands around 1% below pre-pandemic levels. So roughly around 600,000 workers have left the labor force in the UK and have not sort of come back to work compared to pre-pandemic levels. Now, it's interesting, the reasons differ across different countries. So, for example, if you look at why people have not come back in the US, some of them are prime age workers, women who are taking care of children and are sort of, have COVID worries. And that is, those are the people who have stepped out of the labor force. Whereas in the UK, it has been driven mainly by, long-term sickness, by early retirement, and by students. So those are the factors that have led to a decline in participation during the pandemic. And, it does seem like those factors are probably more sticky, probably maybe less related to the pandemic and more to do with the different lifestyle change. And we can clearly go into discussions of why people are not coming back, but it is definitely something that has kept labor shortages at record highs. And even when you look at any sort of measure of labor tightness and how many vacancies are there, for example, per unemployed, those kind of measures are at record highs. This has meant that wage growth has picked up significantly in the UK. So we are now at about 4.5% wage growth. The underlying number, the overall number can be a bit difficult to read because of some base effects, but overall between 4 and 4.5% pay growth is what we are seeing. This is more than what we were seeing before the pandemic, where wage growth was around 3 to 3.5%. So there has been an increase in pay growth. Obviously, it's been skewed by some sectors where the labor shortages are the most, but on an average as well, it has increased. And but what was interesting is that inflation is rising at an even higher rate. So even if these wage increases are happening, it has been insufficient to outpace the increase in inflation, which is why we are seeing the start of a cost of living crisis where real incomes are already getting getting squeezed and are probably going to get worse in April when we have the increase in taxes as well as the increase in the energy price cap. So this is for in terms of our outlook, very healthy labor markets for now, but given the other factors affecting the labor market and incomes such as energy prices and fiscal policy, it's unlikely to it's likely to mean that consumers still face one of the biggest real income shocks in the last decade.
Thank you very much, Sonali. Very helpful to get a sense of some of the kind of bigger picture in terms of what growth is doing within the economy, but then also to kind of tie that back into the likely experience of individuals, particularly in certain sectors. And we'll definitely get into more of that as we go in the afternoon. For now, I want to just bring in Lord Gavin Barwell. And in particular, Gavin, it would be great to get your take on, I guess, not just what the data is telling us, but also given your experience, what you think all of this means for policy.
Thanks, Ben. Pleasure to be with you today, and pleasure to follow Sonali. You started off in your introduction by saying, the government will probably take some satisfaction in the employment and unemployment data, but that wasn't the whole picture. And I think that was an accurate observation on your part. My memory from my period when I was an MP, and you got this monthly data out, is that the sort of political debate would focus on those two indicators. Was a higher proportion of the population in work and was a lower proportion out of work. And I think, as Sonali was saying, the government is entitled to take some credit for the progress that we're seeing in those numbers. If you compare the pandemic and the economic impact that's had with previous economic shocks, it clearly hasn't had anything like the same long-term scarring effect on the labour market. And at least some of the credit for that has got to go to the UK government and indeed other governments around the world for the radical policy measures that they introduced to try and support employment during the downturn. I think from my point of view, in terms of a policy perspective, there are probably 3 or 4 things that I would be thinking about if I was doing my old job in Number 10. The first is the data on the record number of vacancies, job vacancies in the labour market. I mean, we are facing an almost unprecedented situation, essentially, where supply of labour simply cannot keep up with demand. And if you unpick the data and look behind it, I think you can see that there are 2 main things that are contributing to that. One is the Brexit deal that the government negotiated, which once the transition period ended, it meant the end of free movement with the EU, and that clearly has restricted access to the UK labour market. And the second is what people refer to as the Great Retirement. Significant numbers of people, primarily people over the age of 50, who have chosen in the last year or two to come out of the labour market, essentially. The data I saw suggested that there's something like 1.15 million fewer people in the UK labour market today than there would have been if pre-pandemic trends had continued. I think probably, Ben, you have to assume that the government isn't going to undergo some massive U-turn on migration and change its mind on free movement of labour. So we may see a few occupations added to the shortage list. So we may see a bit of flexibility at the margins here or there for crucial professions, but I think it's unrealistic to think the government's overall approach to that issue is going to change, because it's clearly a key issue for a significant chunk of their voter coalition. So it seems to me that the first policy challenge, which is one both for government and also individual employers, is how do you try and find ways of luring some of those people who have left the labour market back into it? How do you reduce the economic inactivity rate? The data there is quite rich. It identifies the reasons why people have dropped out. And the 2 main ones are sort of early retirement and long-term sickness. So there's clearly potentially some long COVID issues there, or maybe issues about other health conditions that got worse during the pandemic. But both the government and employers, some kind of program to try and prevent people leaving the labour market and encouraging those who have left to come back in has clearly got to be a huge requirement. And you can see that these kind of government programs do have an impact if you look at the success that they've had on long-term unemployment. The second issue, I think, that will really concern policymakers is the danger of wage inflation now further reinforcing the inflationary spike that we're going through at the moment, that you get into some kind of self-perpetuating cycle. If you think back maybe 6 months ago, most central banks around the world were telling us that this inflationary spike as the world economy restarted was going to be transient and wouldn't get too high. And with every month that's gone past, it has both looked less transient and the peak figure has increased and increased and increased. And if you look at the latest data from the Bank of England, virtually all of the component bits that build up the CPIH indicator have been increasing. So there's going to be a real concern among politicians, I think, both about real post-tax incomes falling, the cost of living squeeze that working people are going to be going, many working families are going to be going through at the moment, but also the danger that wage inflation kind of gets baked in, and actually this inflationary pressure that we're experiencing turns out to be nothing like as short-lived as everybody was initially hoping. And then I think the third issue that is worth looking at is what impact this tightness in the labour market, this war for talent that we've got going on at the moment, is going to have on return to work policies, return to office policies. Because many of the clients that I speak to are very nervous. They're worried about not getting enough of their staff back into the office regularly enough in terms of mentoring, learning, particularly for new employees and collaboration. But they are very nervous at the moment about pushing too hard because they're conscious that if people chose to leave, if they squeeze too hard on that issue, they would find it incredibly difficult to replace people given the overall conditions in the labour market. So I think probably, Ben, those are the main issues that government will be looking at. How do you lure people back into the labour market? What are the dangers here in terms of getting into a kind of spiral on inflation? And what does all this mean in terms of return to office post-pandemic?
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Gavin. Very, very helpful, and lots to go out there when we get into the wider conversation. I'm going to invite our final speaker to offer some reflections as well, Helen Barnard from Pro Bono Economics. Helen, Gavin's obviously talked a lot there around the kind of inactivity issue and the sorts of policies that we might need to see in order to kind of bring people back into the labour market. It would be great to get your reflections on that, and as well your reflections based on your experience of researching in the area of insecurity and of poverty too, because clearly those are going to be very large issues looking ahead as well. But over to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks everyone. So I agree absolutely with the first two speakers that rising economic inactivity is the big issue in our labour market now, not unemployment for the most part. Economic inactivity is about 400,000 people higher than it was pre-pandemic. And that growth is now being driven primarily by rising ill health. Earlier on in the pandemic, it was other factors. Now it really is ill health. Now I need to dig in a bit more to see what kind of ill health, but some of the emerging analysis suggests that mental ill health is likely to be the key thing that's driving this. So we know that we were seeing rising numbers of people with depression and anxiety even before COVID, and that has been made a lot worse for a lot of people through the pandemic. So we're now seeing those people really struggling to get back into the labour market and struggling to hold on to jobs. Now, I think in policy terms, what I think the danger we're seeing at the moment is policies that are designed to combat the old problems we used to have in previous recessions. I don't think we've yet seen policy catch up to what you need to do to tackle inactivity. So older workers dropping out and ill health driving people out. And there are really two sides to this. So first is, what kind of support services do people need to be enabled and supported and encouraged back into the labour market? And, you know, we saw very recently this new way to work policy, which is very, what I would say, old school. So it's primarily about creating more sanctions, so more of the big stick to pressure people into applying for jobs earlier, which they are not qualified for necessarily and are not the kinds of jobs they want to do. So the idea you can drive people off the benefit roles and into jobs, and that will help with our vacancy problem. Now, that is what was being tried a decade ago. And to be honest, didn't work terribly well then. It definitely doesn't work for inactivity, because what you see is people just start disengaging. And one of the problems we have with services at the moment is what kind of support you get is very tightly linked to what benefit you happen to be getting. So if you are somebody who are not on one of the job seekers allowance or that bit of universal credit, you aren't necessarily getting access to a lot of employment support. And the employment support that is there is too focused on work coach, job centre work coach meetings and hassling people and that kind of pressure. And there is far, far too little of the kind of tailored, personalised support, which is what really helps people who have difficulties with ill health, who have caring responsibilities, who have these kinds of issues, to get back into the labour market or to get the right job for them. So what we've seen, in a sense, we saw the plan for jobs was very good at preventing unemployment. What we now need is a plan for participation. And that means the Department for Work and Pensions reorienting themselves away from high volume work coach, lots of interviews, lots of pressure, to working with often charities who work very effectively with these groups who are further from the labour market to put in place tailored support. The other side of this, though, is actually the jobs themselves. So thinking about the quality of work that's out there, because if we are, in Lord Barwell's words, luring people back into the labour market, we need to look at how attractive some of these jobs are. And particularly at the bottom end of the labour market, you've got an awful lot of jobs which are low paid, which are very insecure, which are very inflexible from an employee point of view, and where you don't know what shifts you're going to be working week to week, you get cancelled a lot, there's very little training, there's very little support, it's hard to match it up with caring for children or adults. And actually those kinds of jobs are not going to be attractive to this group. And to be honest, pre-pandemic, those were jobs that were trapping people in poverty, not freeing them from it. So one of the things we need to do is improve the quality of work at the bottom end of the labour market. So that is things like increasing the rights to security that workers have, because that will both make those jobs a better protection against unemployment and against in-work poverty. And it starts making them more attractive to people who are currently just opting out. And then the last thing I'd say is we need to do a lot more work with employers. So we know there is still quite a lot of prejudice among employers against older workers, against disabled workers, against workers from some ethnic minority groups. So we need to tackle that. And we need to do more to actually help employers redesign some of these jobs so they will be open to a bigger group of people. And the last thing I would say is we need to do all that, not just for now, but because this is the way things are going. We have an aging population, an aging workforce, more people living with health issues, more people therefore also caring. We need to be taking this chance to redesign that labour market so it's actually fit for the next 20, 30, 40 years, and will also help us get out of this looming cost of living crisis plus labour shortage crisis. Both of those can be addressed through this, but we do need policymakers and employers to change direction to focus on the right problem now.
And Helen, you set up there a couple of very big challenges, I think, around this idea of a plan for participation, as well as the need to kind of drive up the quality of work as well. We've had a couple of questions in from audience members, particularly around this issue of economic inactivity, which I'd just like to sort of cover off first before we go into other areas. So the first from Charles Garnett is asking really whether this is playing out differently across different parts of the economy or different parts of the country. Sonali, I wondered whether you had any sort of insight on that from your perspective, as to whether you see some of this inactivity in more acute in certain parts of the country or the economy.
Yeah, I think there has been certain sectors which are hit by these labor shortages and inactivity more than others. So obviously, we initially had, the story of truck drivers, which started this whole discussion, and then it sort of broadened to further groups. But if you just look at where the labor shortages are now, it has spread to a large variety of sectors. So whether it's IT, health, nursing, care, all of even financial services, it has broadened to further sectors. And this is a point that, I want to sort of just add on to what Lord Barwell was saying in terms of the wage pressures, again, starting in these sectors and now becoming a bit more broad-based because of this high inflation problem. So we are seeing this sort of a spiral of high inflation feeding into high wage growth, which and it's interesting how it only started from a small part, and now it's becoming much more generalized. And that is something that the Bank of England, as the central bank who has a mandate to meet their 2% inflation target, would have to raise interest rates in order to avoid that, even though that is an outcome that maybe the government wants to create a high wage, high skill economy. It is unfortunately not compatible with what the Bank of England's inflation target is, which is to keep wage growth at healthy levels, but not at such high levels that it is incompatible with the inflation target.
Thanks, Sonali, and I definitely want to come back to that point you've just raised there about the kind of gap between government ambition around its sort of economic transformation programme and the reality that we might all be facing. But Helen, I think you've also got some regional data in terms of this issue of economic inactivity.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, it is very variable, and there is quite a strong levelling up angle to this as well, as with everything these days. So in England, it's the northeast has got the highest economic inactivity. Yorkshire and the Humber, the northwest, have got those three are the highest, and rates have been rising fastest in those areas as well. And so there is definitely a need for particular support to go into those parts of the country. And as part of the kind of levelling up approach to labour markets, this needs to be baked in. And I don't think we have yet seen that in the plans we saw come out.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you, Helen. Another question that we've got around this issue on skills shortages, labour shortages, is around Brexit, in particular from Tom Schuller, who asks what hard evidence is there on the impact of Brexit on skill and labour shortages. Gavin, you mentioned this in your sort of opening remarks. Would you maybe just be able to sort of expand a little bit on what you see here as the kind of connection between these things?
Yeah, so I would say we have sort of indirect evidence, Ben. We've got this estimate, which I gave in my remarks, that there's 1.15 million fewer people in the UK labour market than we would have expected on the pre-pandemic trend. And actually, if you look at the historic trend, it was fairly uniform growth year by year that you saw in the size of the labour market. And we had the figure that Helen gave. We could identify the number of people the increase in economic inactivity that has taken place. So I haven't seen any data that pins exactly a prediction on how many extra people we'd have in the labour market if we still had free movement, but you can get an idea of the quanta. And it is these two effects combined that are driving that. Sounds like Helen may have a number. I think she was trying to put her hand up. So I'll hand over to her if she's actually seen a figure.
Yes, it isn't my number. It's Institute for Employment Studies. But what I've seen from them is I think they estimate about a third of the labour shortage is probably down to reduced immigration, which is obviously primarily post-Brexit. And about 2/3 is older workers exiting the labour market. So it's big, but it's not the majority.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you both for that. Sonali, at the end of her sort of remarks just before, sort of drew attention to this, that the sort of potential tension, I guess, between the government's stated ambitions of building a high wage, a high skill economy. And we've got a question from somebody in our audience around that as to whether we're really heading in that sort of direction. And clearly the levelling up agenda has had some flesh put on the bones of that in recent weeks. when it comes to the white paper being published and 12 measures or missions being put forward as to how we're to sort of look at levelling up and how we'll know we're making progress. But it did strike me as sort of part of that paper that the definitions and measures around standards of living, pay, job quality could do with more definition to be meaningful and to be real. I just wondered whether, Gavin, you had particular reflections on that and what we might expect to see next in terms of the government sort of putting more flesh on the bones of that.
Yes, I thought that the white paper was a much more serious piece of work than the rhetoric we had at sort of conference time about a sort of high pay economy. I mean, yeah, the government is at least nominally conservative and therefore ought to believe economically that pay increases that aren't driven by higher productivity will ultimately be inflationary. And indeed it was, Sonali was maybe a little too polite to say it, but it was a rather blunt intervention from the Governor of the Bank of England with the inflation figures last week, where he basically told everybody not to ask for high pay increases because it would just make the problem worse, slightly insensitively. Although, I think there is some economic truth behind it. It's a very difficult message to deliver to people on ordinary incomes who are seeing their living standards squeezed by the combination of inflation and interest rate rises and the tax increases that are on their way very shortly. So I thought that the white paper was a more serious piece of work in that regard, and was clearly trying to address the issue of how to improve productivity across the country, and using that to drive increases in pay. And I also, one of the things that I liked about it, Ben, was that, to my mind, too much of the debate on levelling up until the white paper was focused on physical infrastructure, that the solution to the problem was purely investing in physical infrastructure and in research and development. Yeah. And there was much more in the white paper about investing in human capital. And I think that is a good and important focus for the government to have. There was some interesting policy there about improving educational standards in those bits of the country where they fall well below national average, and also about digital upskilling and the sort of digital education service. So I think the more that the government can be encouraged down that road, and Helen gave some really interesting data just then about the regional disparity in the economic inactivity figures, and getting the government to focus on that as a key building block of its plans on levelling up, the better. But I thought that the white paper was at least a step in a good direction in that regard. And it's a big culture change from DWP, I think, to move from these sort of maths programs that are essentially trying to use sticks essentially to push people into the labour market, to actually trying to help people and provide carrots and support. And it's often not just about getting people into the labour market. Now, when I was an MP, I worked quite a lot on the issue of mental health. It's about long-term help to sustain them in the jobs that you get them into as well. It's a big change from the DWP in terms of mindset that it needs to go through.
I suppose a big challenge, Gavin, notwithstanding the sort of the fact that the white paper may represent progress, is the fact there wasn't significant new amounts of money attached to these sorts of new areas that were in across the 12 missions. And even what money there sort of has been around SPF and things like that, the money for skills isn't going to come for at least another sort of 12 to 24 months. So I suppose really, Helen, what we must be looking to see more action taken in that space over the course of the next 12 months at a minimum, if we're going to see progress made through this Parliament.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I agree. I thought the Levelling Up white paper, it set out a very positive framework. And I think, I can see it being something that for years to come can actually provide a bit of a pathway that different governments can follow. And that's really helpful because this is not a short-term thing. But yes, I mean, so at the moment, what we're looking at in the next few years is less money overall going into local growth than there was under the May government, under the Cameron government. And there is no way you create serious change, transformational change without more money. But we knew that. We knew that before the white paper came out. So they will either have to persuade the Chancellor to put more in, or they will have to wait. I agree with Gavin, though, that there was a lot more focus on what people call social infrastructure. At least rhetorically, there was much more talk about investing in people and communities. That's really positive. but again, it's not yet backed up with policies. So there was no mention of childcare. The skills ambition's incredibly timid, actually. It's weirdly unambitious. And when you look at the labour market stuff, they talk a lot about partnerships with private sector businesses to get people into work, which is right. There is strangely very little mention of the role that civil society and charities will need to play alongside those businesses to get the right people into those jobs. So we need to see more focus on that. And we do need to see, the big employment services that DWP, do. They have moved to a model which is mostly work coaches, high volume. They moved away, actually, in the last decade or so from investing in more tailored, personalised support. We're going to need to see that go back in the other direction if we're going to see turnaround in some of these places where you've got really deep-seated long-term changes.
Yeah. We've got a few questions through, folks, all centering around, I think it was the way you posed it, Gavin, around luring people back in to the workplace, or to the labour market rather, but also potentially back into office spaces as well. And I suppose there's a theme really across the questions we've got from Jeff Austin, Lau at the CMI and Astrid Allen around both changing the culture within our workplaces and the implications for managers and for leaders across organisations, but also in terms of potentially trying out and piloting new ways of working. And Astrid in particular asks whether the Kickstart scheme might be used to encourage some of this. Given there's a particular question for you in here, Helen, would you like to kind of respond first around the sort of role of managers and leaders play in redesigning the workplace going forward?
So yes, that is exactly what needs to happen. And there is a real skills and capacity gap, actually, for a lot of employers. They have, particularly middle managers, they don't know how they would redesign their roles. But there have been some really good pilots. So the TimeWise Foundation has been working with employers across different sectors, including retail and hospitality and construction, to pilot how you can redesign some of these jobs so that people who need flexible work, whether it's part-time or whatever, are able to get access to higher level jobs. Because what you often find is people end up working below their skill level because they need jobs in a particular configuration. But I think that person, you've absolutely nailed it, that this is about building the capacity of employers. And we haven't done a lot of that in this country, actually, not on a big scale. And I think that's something we need to scale up. We saw a kind of hint with the way to work. There was mention of more employer partnerships. I think that would be really positive, but we do need to see the scale that's going to happen, because it's been quite fringe, I would say, up until now. It now needs to come into the centre of local labour market policies.
Yeah. And Gavin and Sonali, with the sort of organisations you work with, are you seeing some of this experimentation taking place within different workplaces and sort of a rethinking of the workplace to make it more inclusive?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, there's been, we actually didn't ever work flexibly before. In financial services, we were almost coming to the office every day. And now after the pandemic, because everyone has learned that actually we can work from home and there isn't all these compliance risks that people used to talk about before, those can be met quite with a bit of creativity and a bit of understanding from managers. We've now got back to a more hybrid regime of work where you can sort of work from home and work more flexibly. So I think there has been I think the pandemic obviously has been an extremely difficult time for a lot of people, but at the same time, certain trends that which are positive in terms of understanding flexibility of work and being able to include people who either live far away or have care needs or have other needs, are being able to be lured back into it. And I think one of the statistics which I found fascinating is I did a report looking at women employment during the pandemic, and globally a lot of countries saw a decline in participation across the US, across Germany, across a lot of countries, because women stayed at home during the pandemic for care reasons. And the UK was one of the countries where that did not happen. So women participation actually remained completely flat, or there was bit of a decline, but not as much. It's mainly driven by the drop in men participation. So I think in some way, kudos to the UK flexible workforce, which has allowed women participation to actually not drop off as much as other countries.
Yeah, yeah. And from your perspective, Gavin, I found it interesting that you sort of reflected that some of your clients potentially see the sort of tension here between wanting people back in versus being frightened that therefore they'll lose their staff, rather than sort of approaching this in a way of building a sort of more productive, more flexible environment for their colleagues.
The first thing that strikes, because I work with a whole number of different organisations, one of the things that strikes me just the very varied approaches that different organisations are taking. So one of the organisations I work with is maybe 70 or 80% office attendance of what it was pre-pandemic, and there are others which have barely started. I think that there are three challenges from my sort of anecdotal experience for managers in trying to deal with this. The first thing is just people want different things. I find a lot of the media coverage of this generalizes as if everybody's the same, had the same experience and wants the same thing. So there are people who I know, who I work with, who hated having to work from home, were desperate to get back into an office as quick as they could, missed it terribly. And there are other people who found the experience of spending more time with their family and not having to commute every day transforming for their lives, and are keen to carry on working from home as much as they can. So the first thing that I think you've got to deal with as a manager is just this wide spectrum of what your people want. Then I think most organizations appear to be adopting some kind of hybrid approach. So to give you an example, PwC is one of the organizations I work with, and they've got a model where they're asking people to spend two and a bit days a week at home and be in the office the rest of the time. And there's a challenge, I think, if you're running a meeting and it's a hybrid, it's much easier to have a meeting like this, or a meeting where everybody's physically present, than it is to run a meeting that has a mixture of the two. So there are sort of challenges in adopting to hybrid. And then I think the last thing that I would say is, I do think it requires a bit of direction. My own experience is some days you go into an office and none of the other people that you'd want to collaborate are in, and you kind of think, well, I've come in and I've basically sat and done a whole load of online meetings that I could have done from home. I'm not sure how that's worked for me. So I think it does require some kind of direction where to try and get teams in on similar days. And there's big challenges, I think, for organizations with perhaps a natural human instinct that people can tend to go in on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, less on Mondays, Fridays, and that's not long-term necessarily sustainable, I think. So there are challenges there for managers. But I think if you listen to what Helen in particular had to say in her intervention, there's also some big opportunities here. So there are opportunities to use the flexibility to make it easier for some people to get back into the labour market and address skill shortages. And then also on levelling up. We had basically a model where everyone was commuting into big city centres, and that's where they worked and spent their money there. And actually, most of us are probably now going to spend a bigger chunk of our weeks in the areas where we live. And we don't all have to live maybe as close to work if we're only going in 1 or 2 days a week. So I think the two things I would say, Ben, is it isn't easy, and we're all kind of learning our way to how to get through it and make it work. But we shouldn't have a sort of negative view that it's all a challenge. There are real opportunities here as well.
Yes, yeah. On that sort of theme of opportunities, one area which we're looking at with City Bridge Trust at the moment is around the implications for hybrid working or of hybrid working for those with disabilities in the labour market, and trying to understand the extent to which this is leading to a more inclusive workplace for them. But I do note that we're actually seeing the disability employment gap continue to rise. It is still going up, and it's now above 29 percentage points compared to non-disabled people. And before we kind of address the last couple of questions that are in the chat, because I'm conscious we're heading towards the end of the meeting, I just wondered, Helen, whether in the course of your research that you had any reflection specifically around sort of supporting those with disabilities back into good, sustained employment, and what additional action we might need to see.
Yes, I think it's a really important point. I think the main thing I would say is that when you look back over the last couple of decades about what we have tried to do about the disability employment gap, there has been an immense focus on disabled people as future workers. So all the kind of programs that you do kind of to the worker to try and get them into work. There has been remarkably little done with the employer side. So you've kind of, in terms of both money and effort, there's been really not much attempt. You've got the disability confidence scheme, which is great, but doesn't actually appear to be biting in terms of having an effect yet. And apart from that, you've got, a couple of little programs. And actually, I think that there is a really big job of work around the attitudes among employers, but actually also that capacity building to make people feel that they understand how you make those reasonable adjustments. And actually, particularly if you look at the nature of disability these days, it's not primarily the kind of old, you had someone who was fit and healthy, then they had an industrial accident, and now they are physically disabled. And what you need to do is look at ramps and things. That is there, but actually most of the time, what you get now are people who have long-term fluctuating conditions, mental health conditions, back problems, those kinds of things. And I think that we haven't caught up really with what kind of support both employers and workers need to make work much more feasible. And we're remarkably bad at keeping people in work as well. That bit where someone starts to get ill and you can intervene to keep them in work, but we don't do that very often. And I think, again, we have to get better at that, because once somebody is out and they've been out of work for a while, it just gets harder and harder for them to get back in, and you see the scarring effect. So I think that's where we need to start focusing much more.
That's really helpful, Helen. And I think it's a sort of a part of the labour force that doesn't get always the attention that it sort of merits when sort of thinking about some of these issues. We've probably got just time for one more round of questions from those that have been submitted, and there is a bit of a theme across a number when it comes to the implications of all of this for young people. And the number of young people that we currently have not active in the economy as well, or perhaps not best equipped to access either skills or training due to a lack of investment in further education. I'm conscious we did see the Prime Minister's skill guarantee probably about 12 months ago now. I think it was. It feels like it was probably at the beginning of 2021 that was launched. But it feels to me like we might be in danger of losing a little bit of the impetus around that agenda from government, and in particular the fact there wasn't more money attached to kind of skills as part of the levelling up agenda. It'd be good just to kind of get final reflections around that, the importance of further education, the importance of supporting young people into economic activity over the coming period as well. Sonali, I'll turn to you first.
It's definitely incredibly important. I mean, if you look at a large number of people who sort of dropped out of the workforce in the initial part of the pandemic, a lot of them were sort of young people, and yes, some of them did that for educational purposes, which is positive. Some of them were obviously discouraged workers as well. So we clearly need to. I think there is a big, need for upskilling of workers, especially now that if you want to create a high wage, high productivity economy, you need to start upskilling people, and the first place that starts from is for the young people. So I think it's an incredibly important agenda, and definitely needs to get the attention of the government, and they need to focus on that for sure. Yeah.
And do you think, Gavin, that this government will sort of sustain its interest in that agenda, given it was such a big part of the Prime Minister's personal platform sort of within the last sort of year or so?
I think so. I mean, I think that the urgent need for more investment in FE has been a sort of issue in politics for a long period of time. And I think there is cross-party recognition of that. It's one of the issues that politics hasn't dealt with well, in part because so many MPs, their own experience of education is through HE. So that tends to get a disproportionate share of attention. But I think from the conversations I have with ministers, there is still a focus on that. And I think the point you made about resourcing for the Levelling Up white paper, there's quite a lot of recognition of that within government. They would sort of say to you privately, this isn't the last word on this, and it was a bit unfair to ask us to get to perfection in one step. I think if you look at the money Germany spent post-unification on East Germany, the resourcing we've got behind the Levelling Up paper, the white paper at the moment, looks wholly inadequate. And I think they know that they're going to need to do more there. It's obviously not an easy fiscal situation for the Chancellor at the moment. But the sense I get Ben, is that there is quite strong political commitment behind the FE agenda. So I think it's important that right now, in terms of the data that we're looking at, the focus is obviously on older people who have become economically inactive, and actually the numbers of younger people have improved, because at the start of the pandemic we had a lot of people going into education to become students, and those numbers have headed in the right direction. That doesn't mean there isn't still a real challenge there, particularly about ensuring young people have the right skills to succeed in the modern labour market and raising the quality of jobs that they're getting into.
Fantastic, thank you, Gavin. So I'm conscious we're sort of approaching the last 5 minutes now, and a lot of the issues, if not all of the issues really, that we've spoken about so far, in many respects, it seems to me, are going to require long-term sustained policy action. Whether it's kind of shifting the culture in the way that you've described, Helen, around the welfare system, from being something which is more of a blunt instrument of sort of getting people back to work, as opposed to, you know, the kind of one-on-one tailored support that's going to be required to get people who are perhaps furthest from the labour market, or looking at how people with mental health conditions are sustained in employment, or tackling some of the levelling up issues where we've actually seen decades of entrenched economic decline in places that isn't going to be reversed overnight. So within that context, it's a slightly unfair question to each of you, in that I'm going to ask whether there is a sort of a single thing or a couple of things that, in order to kind of get us moving at least in that direction, you would like to see as part of either the Chancellor's next budget, or of course we've got the Queen's speech coming up relatively soon. Helen, I'll start with you.
So I think I was focused on the Queen's speech, and we have been promised for years now an employment bill, and I hope very much we will see that in this Queen's speech, and it will be followed through, and particularly using that to improve security at the bottom end of the labour market. That seems to me, you know, the most pressing need, and there is now pretty good evidence that if you improve security at the bottom, you also tend to boost productivity. You keep people in work, you keep progression, and so on. So I think actually getting on with that would be an incredibly positive thing to do. I think in terms of the budget, I think we'd like to see more support for people who are out of work, because there's not been a lot of support through universal credit for those people. But also, to be honest, DWP got quite a lot of money in the last budget. I think it's about how they use those billions to address the participation problem and work with employers, and not carry on down this pathway they seem to have started with.
Fantastic, thank you, Helen. Gavin, it'd be great to get your reflections.
And so I'm going to slightly cheat and say two things, because I would have basically made the same point as Helen. It seems to me that the sort of the trick here is to preserve the flexibility that's one of the strengths of the UK labour market further up the income scale, whilst providing security for people at the bottom. It's very much like housing. If you've got quite a lot of money, having the ability to sort of shift around very quickly is great. But if you're not, you know, if you're not well off, the insecurity in our housing market is incredibly damaging to household and family well-being, essentially. And I think it's the same in terms of the world of work. But since Helen said that, I'm going to say something different, which I'm not sure if necessarily is even budget or legislative, but I just think it would be a really positive step, which is one of the things that struck me since I left Number 10 is the passion that lots of employers have for getting more engaged in reskilling and training up young people. And I don't think LEPs ever really solved that trick of trying to get a closer relationship between what employers in a local labour market want and ensuring that our FE system is delivering people with those skills. So trying to find a way of solving that fairly long-standing problem of making sure that our education system, particularly FE, is delivering the skills that are actually in demand in the local labour market, and thinking forward to, you know, to decarbonisation, some of those other sort of big national programs we've got, and we know the kinds of skills that are going to be required for those.
What I would say on that front, Gavin, is there is some very interesting work going on within Lancashire on that very note, where the LEP is bringing together further education providers and employers around that shift to net zero. But the point more generally is very well made.
It's very variable around the country.
Absolutely, yeah. Sonali, the last word to you on this.
I mean, I think everything that had to be said has been said. I think just a couple of points. I completely agree. I think, you know, we have, I think in some way what has been exposed is that there is a skill shortage, and maybe Brexit in some way has exacerbated that. As in the past, whenever we needed those skills, we did have an access to the European markets and European labor markets in particular, who would be able to meet that skill shortage. And now, clearly, because of the political decisions, the aim is to make sure that the indigenous population in the UK can do those jobs and could provide those skills. So if that's the political decision, I think there needs to be policy that supports that, and as well in the budget. I think a very final point, which is sort of related, but I think that there needs to be more done to even address the very near-term cost of living squeeze that households are facing. I think what the Chancellor has announced does not scratch the surface of how big the squeeze is going to be, and so the borrowing figures are actually on board. If anything, they're better than expected. There is some money that can be used in the very near term to address that issue. So I think I would want to see more on how to sort of reduce the cost of living crisis that's coming in April.
I would certainly echo that. I think as soon as the sort of details were unveiled of the Chancellor's intervention, it struck me that that was very, very unlikely to be sufficient. And we've sort of seen a similar pattern through the sort of latter stages of the pandemic, where the Chancellor was prepared to come back and improve the offer, make it more substantive and fitting to the challenge. So I would agree with that. I expect to see that happen. But I think that just about brings us to a close in terms of the event this afternoon. I'd just like to say a huge thank you to our panelists for all of their contributions, as well as to everybody who's attended and people who've put questions forward, and the Work Foundation team who've led on producing our analysis and on putting sessions like this together. We're going to be continue working on these issues, particularly in relation to insecurity in the labour market. We've got some significant research coming forward in the first quarter of this year on that, so please do look out for it. And we'll also be in touch regarding the next instalment of this event series, so please do look out for details on that as well. But for now, thank you very much once again. I hope you found the discussion valuable and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.